It's strange how vividly I remember that night, like a nightmare that clings to the edges of your mind, impossible to shake off. Working the night shift at a rehab facility, especially in a neighborhood like ours, is the kind of job that requires a certain level of vigilance and nerves of steel. The facility is secured by a locked gate, watched over by two cameras. One of them is positioned high up, angled down to capture a full view of the entrance and the area around it, while the other, a doorbell camera, allows for two-way audio. I can see both feeds clearly from the monitors in my office, which I glance at every so often, more out of habit than expectation. The night had started out as unremarkable as any other. The soft hum of the building's air conditioning was the only sound as I sat in the faintly buzzing glow of fluorescent lights, filling out paperwork and occasionally sipping cold coffee. This kind of calm at night can be both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it lets you focus. On the other, the silence sometimes leaves too much room for your mind to wander. A little past midnight, I glanced up at the main monitor, and that's when I first saw him. A man was walking along the street outside the gate. At first, he looked like just another passerby, maybe heading home after a late shift or, more likely, out wandering the neighborhood. I figured he'd walk on, as they usually do. But something about his movements seemed odd, slow and deliberate, as if he didn't quite remember how to walk naturally. He stopped in his tracks just beyond the reach of the gate's dim floodlight. I remember feeling a slight pang of unease then, though I couldn't quite say why. Maybe it was the way his body seemed almost frozen, his back half turned as though he'd forgotten where he was going. And then he turned. Slowly, so slowly that it was almost theatrical, he turned and looked directly up at the camera. There was a deadness in his gaze, like his eyes were void of any thought or emotion, just dark and blank. It was an unsettling stare, the kind that makes you feel as though you're being watched, even when you know it's the other way around. In this neighborhood, we're no strangers to strange visitors lingering outside the gate. It's usually best not to engage unless they're causing a disturbance or trying to force their way in. But something about him didn't feel like the typical case. The emptiness in his expression had a weight to it, a kind of intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't help but feel as if he was staring directly at me, though he had no way of knowing I was on the other end of the lens. After a few minutes of this unsettling silence, I decided to break protocol and hit the intercom. "Hey there, are you okay?" My voice echoed slightly through the microphone, sounding hollow. No response. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give any indication that he'd heard me. He just continued to stare, his eyes never leaving the camera. It was as if he was seeing through the lens, staring at me, but with no real interest or emotion. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a heavy instinctual dread creeping in. Something about him felt so wrong, like he wasn't entirely human. I shook off the thought, mentally scolding myself for letting my imagination run wild. But the feeling lingered, a prickling sense of danger. Minutes dragged by, and he didn't move an inch. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and he was still there, as if frozen in time, his hollow eyes fixed on the camera. It became harder to focus on my paperwork. I found myself glancing up at the monitor every few seconds, my body tense, waiting for him to make a move. Any move. But he just stood there, a dark silhouette against the dim glow of the streetlight. As the first hour ticked by, my unease turned into outright fear. I'd never seen anyone just stand like that for so long, without so much as a twitch or a shift in stance. His stillness felt almost supernatural, as if he were something other than human, something that didn't need to move or blink or even breathe. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching out unbearably. I could feel sweat gathering on the back of my neck as I sat, paralyzed by an inexplicable dread. My rational mind told me he was just a man, probably on drugs or in some kind of mental distress. But there was a small, persistent voice in the back of my mind, whispering that he was something else entirely, something I couldn't explain or understand. When the 2-hour mark rolled around, I finally forced myself to get up. I couldn't sit in that office, suffocating in the silence, with his gaze burning through the monitor any longer. I needed to move. to break the oppressive stillness that had taken hold of the room. I walked the halls doing a quick round of the facility, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a shadow. The quietness of the empty corridors, usually a comfort, during my rounds felt ominous now, like the building itself was holding its breath. I was acutely aware of every creak and groan in the walls, every hum of machinery. By the time I made it back to the office, I felt a small measure of relief. Maybe, I thought, he'd finally wandered off. But as I stepped back into the room, my eyes flicked up to the monitor, and my heart sank. He was gone. The sense of relief I'd been hoping for didn't come. Instead, a cold dread settled in my chest. The emptiness of the screen was somehow even more unsettling than his presence had been. It was as if he'd simply vanished, leaving no trace, no explanation. I stared at the empty feed, half expecting him to reappear, to fill that void with his unblinking gaze. The silence of the office felt suffocating, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had been watching me. But I was trapped, bound to the facility by the responsibility of my job, and by the fear that if I stepped outside, I'd find him waiting for me, just beyond the reach of the gate. The rest of my shift dragged by in unbearable tension, each second a battle against the urge to keep looking at the monitor, to check if he'd come back. I felt his absence like a weight pressing down on me, a presence that lingered long after he was gone. When the sun finally began to rise, casting weak light through the windows, the tightness in my chest loosened just a fraction. I clocked out, leaving the facility as quickly as I could without breaking into a full run. But even as I walked away, the feeling of his eyes on me lingered, a haunting sensation that clung to me like a shadow. For weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that empty stare burning into me. I found myself avoiding the monitor during my shifts, unable to bear the thought of seeing him again, of feeling that same inexplicable dread. In all the years I've worked the night shift, I've never felt fear like that night.